Religious experience must be considered as a fact. It consists of a certain widespread, direct apprehension of a character exemplified in the actual universe. Such a character includes in itself certain metaphysical presuppositions. Insofar as we trust the objectivity of the religious intuitions, to that extent we must also hold that the metaphysical doctrines are well-founded. It is for this reason that the broadest view of religious experience must be insisted on. If, at this stage of thought, we include points of radical divergence between the main streams, the whole evidential force is indefinitely weakened. Thus, religious experience cannot be taken as contributing to metaphysics any direct evidence for a personal God in any sense transcendent or creative. The universe, thus disclosed, is through and through interdependent. The body pollutes the mind pollutes the body. Physical energy sublimates itself into zeal. Conversely, zeal stimulates the body. The biological ends pass into ideals of standards, and the formation of standards affects the biological facts. The individual is formative of the society, and the society is formative of the individual. Particular evils infect the whole world. Particular goods point the way of escape. The world is at once a passing shadow and a final fact. The shadow is passing into the fact, so as to be constitutive of it, and yet the fact is prior to the shadow. There is a kingdom of heaven prior to the actual passage of actual things, and there is the same kingdom finding its completion through the accomplishment of this passage. But just as the kingdom of heaven transcends the natural world, so does this world transcend the kingdom of heaven. For the world is evil, and the kingdom is good. The kingdom is in the world, and yet not of the world. The actual world, the world of experiencing and of thinking and of physical activity, is a community of many diverse entities, and these entities contribute to or derogate from the common value of the total community. At the same time, these actual entities are, for themselves, their own value, individual and separable. They add to the common stock, and yet they suffer alone. The world is a scene of solitariness in community. The individuality of entities is just as important as their community. The topic of religion is individuality in community. This is Alfred North Whitehead. I want to introduce you to this British mathematician and philosopher's understanding of the universe. He has an interpretation that comes out of 20th century physics, relativity, and quantum theory. But he has a perspective that's also fed by the Romantic nature poets, by the idealist tradition, even though Whitehead himself is not an idealist. Whitehead develops what we could call a panpsychist cosmology. There are many varieties of panpsychism, many species of this particular mode of thought. What it means is that some form of interiority, some form of experience or experiential capacity pervades the universe at all scales and every level of organization. Because for a thinker like Whitehead, there is no level of manifestation that isn't organized. So he called his philosophy the philosophy of organism. So he's an organic realist, you might say. He sees life, and life in the most general sense is the ability to experience and experience just means the ability to inherit a past and imagine a future. To be capable, right, of being in transition between the actualized facts of the past and the definite possibilities left open by that past. That is what experience is, and panpsychism is the idea that this capacity to, as Alfred Korzybski might say, to bind time is a metaphysical principle that we have to use to understand any kind of reality at all. That's Whitehead's argument, at least. But he's not just a panpsychist. His variety of panpsychism is process relational. It has a process orientation and it's a relational ontology. So to be a process philosopher is to think in terms of activities, to think in terms of processes of transition and becoming, rather than in terms of static things that interact in a non-participatory way, where a participatory interaction would be more like a transaction, where both parties are transformed in the act of their encounter. For Whitehead, therefore, to be in process is also to be in relation, and his universe, as we just heard from him, is a universe of interrelations, of interdependence, and ultimately the universe is a cosmic society. But it's a society of individuals, right? And Whitehead is not just a holist who, in some sense, reduces the parts to the whole. He's also a pluralist and wants to acknowledge the ultimate importance of the individual. And he doesn't mean, he's not advocating individualism in the European classical liberalist tradition. He's arguing at a metaphysical level. For Whitehead, reality is quantum, right? And his way of incorporating and taking seriously the revolution in physics that is represented by quantum theory is to understand a reality as a series of interlocked quanta, where a quanta is a drop of experience, a moment where, given what's been actualized in the past, a waveform opens up, right? A field of possibilities opens up that is then actualized. And in each moment of the universe's existence and self-creation is what Whitehead calls a concrescence. It's the growing together of the many, the achievement of a new one, which then adds itself to the many, so that the next concrescence includes it in its comprehension of the already actualized past. And again, the many become one and are increased by one to the crack of doom. This is Whitehead's metaphysics of creativity in a concrescent nutshell. And so, this may sound all very abstract, but really Whitehead is just he's generalizing the quantum theory of, what we would refer to as the collapse of the wave function. Only for Whitehead, the wave function collapse in each and every drop of experience. And these drops of experience grow together into larger, what Whitehead calls societies. So you're no longer dealing with just an individual drop of experience at the level of a society. You're dealing with, a higher order organizational pattern. And what this pattern allows for, what it facilitates, all of these various individual actual occasions of experience growing together into larger societies. They're providing a kind of sheltering and filtering and channeling experience of the universe through an organized system, what we call a nervous system, so as to present to a certain, what Whitehead calls presiding occasion. And in the case of a human being, we're a whole society of countless microcosmic actual occasions of experience. This society of little creatures with their own little perceptions, their own little experience of what the world is, grow together into our organism, and in so doing provide a sensory filter and a kind of metabolic sheltering for a stream of actual occasions of experience that Whitehead says hover in the interstices of the brain, in the empty space of the brain. And there is sheltered our consciousness, what we call our consciousness. So our consciousness is still a series of actual occasions of individuals concressing, inheriting one another. But it's achieved by this wider ecology, this wider set of relations. And in calling our attention to the organic dimension of reality, Whitehead is trying to remind the conscious ego of its embeddedness in an ecology of organisms. And that it is the achievement of an ecology of organisms, not some outside alien spectator upon a merely physical universe. And see, there's been a tendency in the history of Western philosophy since Descartes, so we might say a tendency in modern European philosophy since Descartes, to appropriate all of the psychic or psychological energy, all of the spiritual energy, appropriate it, suck it out of nature, put it into ourselves. So we deflate nature, we disenchant nature, and we inflate the ego. We turn nature into a machine, and we attribute freedom of the will to the human ego. And Whitehead's trying to reverse this and say, human beings do have freedom. We're creative. We are intelligent creatures. And so is the rest of the natural world. Human beings being merely an expression of a creativity that is cosmic in its influence and expression. So Whitehead's a radically non-anthropocentric philosopher. He's an anthrodecentric thinker. He's trying to return us to our senses in many ways, and to challenge much of the European philosophical tradition for its anesthetic orientation. Anesthesia, it's what you get. It's when the patient is put to sleep before surgery, right? That's what's used, anesthesia. And literally, to translate the Greek, it just means to kind of lose our senses, to dull our senses, to go to sleep. And Whitehead's offering what I've called an aesthetic ontology, right? Aesthetics, that's the study of appearance, of beauty. But more generally, it's the philosophical inquiry into the nature of experience, what there is to perceive, and how indeed conception is itself emergent from experience, right? Rather than, again, a kind of outside observer upon experience, as philosophy since Descartes has liked to imagine. So Whitehead wants to develop an aesthetic ontology to return us to our senses, to allow philosophers to take not only the clear and distinct visual images granted us through our eyes, but to take seriously also the feelings of the viscera, right? To include the entirety of human experience as relevant, including religious experience as relevant to our attempt to understand the world, to cosmologize or to philosophize. Religious experience is just as important as science. So Whitehead, in the passage that I read, will talk about how we need to take religious experience as a fact, as part of the universe that we are trying to understand when we do science. And what this entails for Whitehead is recognizing that there is an eternal dimension to time. And that, yes, he's a process philosopher, right? So he takes time as seriously as a philosopher can take time, but he also sees how eternity participates in time, or as Plato put it, as time is a moving image of eternity. And these two notions of eternality and temporality are abstractions from a more concrete, inarticulated experience, perhaps unarticulable experience. When we talk about flux and when we talk about permanence, I think we shouldn't fail to recognize how much each of those terms depends on a definition of the other in order to mean anything. What is flux without a preconception of stasis? And what is stasis or permanence without some preconception of change or flux? So Whitehead's trying to think in a complementary way, which we might also call in an integral way, to avoid oppositions and to avoid an easy synthesis, instead to work through the complexity, the difficulty, and arrive at some open-ended hypotheses. And they're metaphysical hypotheses, right? So they're different from scientific ones in the sense that you can't experiment on them in a laboratory. I mean, you can see if they're adequate to your experience, but you can't test in a falsifiable way your metaphysical hypotheses. But these metaphysical hypotheses provide the conditions for the possibility of understanding the scientific experiments, right? When scientists use concepts to interpret their experiments, their empirical experiments, and those concepts themselves don't just spring, from nowhere. They're created, they're fabricated, and philosophy, as Deleuze taught us, is the creation of concepts. Gilles Deleuze was a French post-structuralist philosopher who, maybe one of his more famous books, Difference and Repetition, was published in 1968, and deals with Whitehead. He also wrote a book called The Fold, which is mostly on Leibniz, but includes a chapter on Whitehead. So Deleuze is a French inheritor of the Whiteheadian mode of thought, I think you might say. So Whitehead wants us to take the empirical study of the universe seriously, and he wants us to take religious experience seriously. And his cosmology is an attempt to integrate these two very human perspectives on the universe so that we humans can begin to feel like we belong in this universe. And you might say, I think the only way that human beings can feel like they belong to the universe is to anthropomorphize that universe, to make it human-friendly. But I think when we inquire more deeply into what it means to be a human being, we start to recognize that the most human part of us is precisely that part which is driving us to try to understand the universe. So it's the cosmos, in other words, that's going to teach us how to be a human being, and that has always taught us how to be human beings. As Plato recognized in the Timaeus, and I keep bringing up Plato because Whitehead famously told us that all of European philosophy is but a series of footnotes to Plato. And in the Timaeus, Plato claims that all human science and art, farming, culture itself was taught to us by the stars, that learning to track the movements of the heavens is what raised the human soul up off of its earthly prison for Plato, so that it began to look up and reconnect with its celestial roots. Plato described the human being as an upside-down plant whose roots grow up into the air, into the sky, to connect it with the cosmic nous, the cosmic mind. Whitehead inherits Plato's philosophy in many ways, including his idea of eternal ideas or forms. But Whitehead inverts Plato. Whitehead turns Plato upside down, and instead of the forms, the perfect archetypal ideas of which mere physical objects are but poorer imitations of, for Whitehead, this is reversed so that it's the actual physical experiencing being that is most real and most perfect, while the archetypal realm, or the realm of eternal forms, is deficient in actuality, and doesn't, in fact, exist in the sense of being an actual creature and an actually existing occasion of experience. Whitehead inverts Plato and emphasizes the degree to which the real key to understanding the nature of reality is participation, is the way that every moment is in part creation and in part relation. We might call this co-relation or co-creation. Every moment is a dance in the choreography of coexistence, as Umberto Maturana and Francisco Varela once put it. And so Whitehead's inviting us into an understanding of the universe that allows us as human beings to begin to participate with a wider form of cosmic intelligence, such that we can inhabit this planet in a more sensitive way, in a way that allows us to grasp the beauty of existence. And for that, the desire to grasp that, not just the beauty, but the truth and the goodness of the universe as well, that is what would drive our civilization. Whitehead recognized already 100 years ago that the course of industrial civilization was marching headlong off a cliff, because its way of imagining the universe and the Earth community as nothing but a valueless collection of objects, inanimate, dead objects, that this way of viewing the Earth was in fact going to kill the Earth, to kill us. And Whitehead offered his organic philosophy as a way of averting this catastrophe. And his invitation is one that I encourage all of us to take up. We need to not just act our way out of this crisis, but think our way out of it. We need to imagine a new world in order to inhabit that new world. And Whitehead offers us many avenues forward that I encourage you to check out. And I'm certainly available to point you towards more resources, to introduce you to Whitehead. I hope that this has whet your appetite. So thanks for listening.